Yeah. There you go.
Is it good?
Yeah, if you want to, I'll turn on go for it.
What do you think?
Yeah, this is they're in our lab. Can everyone on Zoom here? Sorry, camera. On Zoom, can you give a thumbs up if you can hear?
Yes, we can hear, I guess.
Okay,
Thanks.
okay, great. Take it away.
Oh, thanks for the kind introduction. Yeah, so where to start? We barely know each other. So I guess the topic of this is biomaterials, but I guess I'm curious, are you guys mostly undergrads, graduate students, computer scientists, philosophers? Like, what's the background?
Thanks.
Yeah. Anyone with like a chemistry? How do you guys feel about who loves chemistry? 24%. Who hates chemistry? Cool. This should be interesting. So I guess for the outline, the title is biomaterials, but biomaterials kind of stands, at least currently, a little bit in opposition to what goes by the name of plastics. So we're kind of going to do a crash course in just, I guess, thinking about plastics, sort of why they're a problem, and then introduce, using biomass as an alternative. And we're going to focus a little bit on some work that we're doing where we're trying to use biomass for the production of menstrual pads. That's sort of the rough outline. I think is basically what that says. And so, yeah, I guess to keep it a little bit conversational, plastic, what is it to you guys?
I feel like it's in everything.
Yes.
I feel like everything I'm looking around is everywhere. It's like pretty versatile, I guess, because I feel like if you drop it, nothing's really gonna happen to it. But obviously I understand where it comes from, and most of the time if something's disposable, just like that's it, some trash.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Molecular thoughts? Polymers?
Something like crude oil. Is that
Generally, yeah. That's the main feedstock.
It's cheap
It's cheap and persistent.
and molecules are long because it's a polymer.
Mhm.
And, it's difficult to destroy it,
Mhm.
and it's resistant
Mhm.
to a lot of acids,
Yeah.
other chemicals, and you can make different characteristics, properties to these
Yeah.
materials, and there are a lot of different classes.
Yeah.
Acetylene, yeah,
Acetylene?
yeah. I mean, it's you polymerize it and then you get
Yeah. That's one of the
way to produce the plastic. Yeah.
Like if you were to describe plastic, what would you say the properties are? Like you can think, just name anything for you, like a water bottle. What are the properties of a water bottle versus
Yeah.
properties?
PET, ABS,
Legos.
yeah, Legos, yeah,
Plastic. Yeah.
which is PLA, yeah, for poly,
Polylactic acid.
yeah,
3D printers.
yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite plastic?
My favorite one is chips.
Oh.
Yeah.
High impact polystyrene.
Yeah. It sounds weird. You make a prototypes like cases, and then it's very easy to polish for sending.
My favorites are really great.
Oh, laser cutting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I like ABS because of Legos. Okay, that's fun. Let's see. So this kind of echoes, I think a lot of what we're going to present kind of just echoes a lot of these comments already. So that's good. So this is a quote, I think, from around the 40s or so, by some guys that were reflecting on plastics and basically just saying that no other, you can read it, no other class of materials has so many different properties, right? And you have this really vast design space that comes from having a well understood chemistry. So it's kind of hard to give up when you have this like what would you call it, a Swiss Army knife of matter, something like that. So keep that in mind. And yeah, household plastics, right? You mentioned polystyrene. There's, of course, in addition to HIPs, there's extruded polystyrene, which is probably the worst thing in the environment because it's low density. Polyethylene would be your Ziploc bags or sealable polyethylene pouches. I think is what the original patent Ziploc is. Polypropylene is what we breathe through for 2 years with N95 masks. They're also a key ingredient in menstrual pads. Well, partial ingredient, yeah, they're not key. Polyvinyl chloride, these are piping. PET is water bottles. Nylon is used. We're probably wearing nylon. Most of us. Yeah, parachutes for during the war. Polyurethane for those fake leather wallets and book covers and seats and polytetrafluoroethylene cookbook. Yeah. Okay, so it's everywhere. And like again, this just goes with the diversity aspect, right? So being able to kind of look at these sort of molecular pictures and get a little bit of an intuition about what's going on. If you like chemistry, then it might be second nature. If you don't like chemistry, then it just looks like cute squiggles, maybe. But hopefully try to, in a couple slides, just give you a little bit of an intuition of the kind of structure function perspective. So yeah, but I guess a little bit of history.
Yeah, just a little bit of history. So like, why do we even invent plastic? And so one of the more anecdotal story is that, this guy, John Hyatt, there was a call by the New York, the company, but they were losing elephants, and then ivory was also getting very scarce, and they were making these billiard balls. So those are mainly from ivory, and they have this kind of the clicking noise that it was just very specific to ivory. But that if that's a dwindling supply, then how can we make that? So there's this guy played the study that it actually was developed even one I think like 5 years earlier by another guy, but he was actually the one who actually implemented it into a form that could be used in an everyday object. So this is when it starts to infiltrate our everyday household use and everything. So this is not something that's like you make only for the rich and everything. So this is when it starts coming down to the common. And then a few years later, this guy named Leo Bakeland made something called Bakelite. This is very similar to when they used to make buttons and everything out of it. Super toxic to make, super toxic when it breaks. Basically phenol formaldehyde, very, very toxic chemicals. You don't want to break this, you don't want to give this to your kids. The idea of like plastic toys for kids, that was never a thing. You don't want to put this in your mouth. And then maybe like 20 years later, when World War II happens, and Anton already mentioned this with the parachutes, and the plastic production just amplified. So one other anecdotal story was the combs that the Army used was also made from hard rubber. So they want to also use their rubber for other war purposes. So then they switched over to plastic, and so that can be used for others. Yeah, and from that on point, post World War II basically has fully infiltrated into the common good. So it became into nylon and tights, toothbrushes and everything basically. From that point on, we just cannot live without.
Yeah, and I guess one thing there is, in from the perspective of today, there is sort of this negative in it, but in many ways because of its cheapness and versatility, right? It made a lot of these products accessible. So it had a very, in some sense, democratizing effect. And also, I wonder how many elephants were saved. They weren't converted into billiard balls because they could be replaced, and also allowed for more people to have access to billiards. Is probably not the best example, but thing with toothbrushes might be a little bit better. The alternative for toothbrushes was animal hair, so that was problematic because get animal hair, and then they're also just less consistent, like deteriorate and stuff like that. Dental care, kind of made more accessible through nylon fibers.
And one other thing to point out is that here you can see the very first one is more of a hybrid between natural fibers and chemicals, whereas when Leo took over, it was all synthetic, so it was just all chemicals. Yeah, so there's this whole campaign around the plastic age, bringing it into the house. They've had expositions about plastics, and DuPont is a big supporter of this, obviously, they're the ones making it. So nothing can stop plastic. Plastic is this kind of idealized increasing standard of living in every sort of aspect. And there's the nylon stuff that I mentioned earlier, but then there's this idea of what is actually really in plastic, and people were starting to get concerned about what it is, and this idea it's convenient for my life, this idea of using Teflon and everything, but what's actually really in it, what actually goes into making it. So there's this idea of disbelief around plastic that started very early on, and despite all that, we are still using plastics today, because the cost aspect is just astronomically cheaper than everything else.
Yeah.
Oh.
There's one thing here. If you want to do a little bit of a deep dive on sort of plastics and biomaterials, there's a series of 2 essays by this guy, Sung Shu, who has a couple of essays that are excellent. It kind of contextualizes the growth of plastic as being kind of the first viral technology. So making an analogy with other products, and then there's some forward-looking perspectives on how biomaterials are being commercialized.
Is this better? If we stand closer?
Yeah, this is better, thanks.
I want to stand closer.
Stand closer. Okay. Yeah. So would highly recommend that, and I guess Ellie, you guys can send it out on Twitch? Discord, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to size a little bit later, but this is just a nice segue. Just you can see that the production of sisal kind of rose, and we realized that we can use it in ropes and a lot of kind of more industrial usage.
Yeah, so sisal is it's a cactus essentially. It's like very similar to what you'd make tequila from. And what's interesting about this graph is basically 1960, there's a huge, this bubble burst essentially. But it's not a bubble. Sisal, in this production in Tanzania, was the primary source for naval ropes. And so around 1960, most of this has been replaced by nylon. And so it's kind of this other aspect where, we're talking about, plastic making things like toothbrushes more accessible, but at the same time, that also this change in how the materials are being made and produced also leads to essentially an economic depression in Tanzania. This is an enormous part of their economy that collapsed through the introduction of this synthetic material. And I mean, the extent of this, it's kind of interesting for a plant that pretty much, I haven't met anyone that really knows of this. I didn't know about it until I started working on this project. It literally was the entire country, and it's one of the largest in Africa. So yeah, so that's just kind of an interesting quirk of history now, but
Wait, so like, how is this made from that? Is it just like fibers and it's like turned into a rope or?
Essentially, yeah,
So you put, you harvest these leaves and you put it through something that's called decorticator. Basically, just a job to remove everything else except for the fibers, and the fibers were then dried, and then spun.
and oftentimes that was done by hand, the decortication, which is, it's sort of like similar to the cotton ginning process, but for a different plant. That's, yeah. It's very labor intensive. So, all this to say, it's like a little bit of culture and history, but it's also rooted in a particular class of materials, polymers. Polymers are chains of molecules, and yeah, basically these two things are kind of like, if you have an intuition about these, you can understand a lot of their properties and yeah, reason about them a little bit. And those two things are molecular weight distribution and the chemical structure, the kind of chemical functional groups that they present. And that'll get you pretty far, I would say. So polymerization, this is one slide, but I mean, like this arrow here in red, that's like, probably a couple graduate courses to master that. It's an incredibly diverse, mature field on its own. But all of this to say that you go from very simple monomer protein, for instance, or acetylene, if you're making, I think ABS uses acetylene as a feedstock. You do a polymerization reaction and you end up with something called polypropylene. And if you go on Wikipedia, where this image is from, you'll end up with a structure that's represented by a simple sort of element and then an N, and the N is basically saying, we think this polymer is about, N units long, but it's a statistical property because, the chemical reaction is, depending on chemistry, is more or less controlled, poorly controlled, I should say. So, rather than getting one, chain of, 100 units, you'll end up with a distribution like this. And these are some common ways of describing it in terms of molecular number or molecular weight. But, it's one number to represent an average. And this average will influence its properties. Heavier polymers tend to be more impact resistant. They'll have different rheological properties. So they'll absorb more energy before they can start flowing, things like that. And of course, those will affect the kind of manufacturing processes that you can affect. And just going back to this, because this is as much, what plastic is as it is about how it connects to society. This pretty simple looking molecule, right? It's $145 billion a year industry, growing at an annual rate of 5.8%, according to some people. Who I didn't cite. But those are estimates anyway. So yeah, as I was saying here, molecular weight distribution influences things like thermodynamics, so melt temperatures, glass transition temperature, mechanics, so yeah, strength, yield, all the things that you can build with rheology, very important for processing. And again, each of these are kind of like courses on their own, right? You can spend a whole course on probably mechanics of, definitely mechanics, but probably also mechanics of polymers. And the same goes for the other categories. But I just want to highlight maybe the glass transition temperature because it's probably maybe the most interesting and also the least understood. So it's exciting in that sense. And it also extends to things beyond polymers. You could also taxonomize polymers if you go from the individual chain, right? An individual polymer chain now to an assembly of those. So material, they tend to be amorphous materials. So they have a mixture of ordered regions and disordered regions. So in that way, they're like a glass, right? Glasses, well, they're hard and you might think of them as crystalline. They're not, they're disordered and they kind of look like this. This is the idealized structure. This would be very brittle, and this is the more brittle than glass already is. And then this is this is sort of the idea of thinking of this. And the glass transition, I mean, it's a transition the nature of the transition is a bit weird because, I mean, the microscopic picture and how it relates to these macroscopic depictions, going from a kind of a melt that you can mold with to something that's fixed and can be set in glass. You have this dramatic change in the viscosity, right, and the rheological properties. But kind of what's happening at the microscale isn't really well understood. So it's just like a big open area in physics right now, just kind of understanding the in a generic way properties of glass transitions. But it's an aspect of polymer physics as well. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this particular slide? It's maybe very pretty. Yeah, so this is another aspect of, I guess, glassiness, right? This oh, right. A very palpable example in the context of polymers is, say, the difference between polystyrene and polypropylene or polyethylene. So polyethylene and polypropylene at room temperature are flexible, or you can make a resealable pouch out of it, a Ziploc. Whereas if you do that with polystyrene, it's brittle, right? And the way that's generally understood is, your polystyrene's glass transition temperature is much lower. Let's get this confused, but it would be much lower, so it's brittle. It's in this regime, whereas things like polyethylene, polypropylene would be in sort of this regime at room temperature. And so that's something that you can very easily feel. And this is more just a fun thing here, where it's the longest running physics experiment, and it's called the pitch drop experiment. So basically, in the 20s or so, some guys at the University of Queensland decided to put some asphalt into a glass funnel and watch. So this experiment is going on for 100 years. And it's made 7 droplets over time. So this material and that material is the same, and it's this idea of time scales. And that's kind of the key aspect of the transition temperature. That things are mobile, but over incredibly long time scales that may not be relevant for you. Right. I mean, for most practical purposes, it doesn't matter that this moves infinitesimally at 1 drop every 10 years. Oh, and here's the graph of it. You can see, 1 drop every 8 years or so. Okay, so coming back to polymers a little bit. To just again, this is a very coarse introduction, but here's polypropylene. It has a methyl group on the side chain. So you have your polymer backbone, and these blue elements would be the side chain. And the side chain determines, like I've alluded to, a lot of things, including its ability to be resistant to acids, chemicals, its ability to be dissolved, for its solution properties, but also its density, its glass transition temperature. And so in the case of polypropylene, here there are 3 different versions of it in some sense. And the differences between these are essentially the orientation of the side groups relative to the backbone. And in this case, they're sort of random. In this case, they're that's called atactic, no tacticity. I don't know the etymology of tacticity. That might be useful in this case, but I don't know. Syntactic, I believe it's in German. So I think it translates to syntactic. In this case, they're basically alternating. And so you can imagine if you're alternating, you're able to give yourself a little bit more space, right? If you have, you'll pack differently. And then isotactic, all the side chains are on the same side. And just in each of those cases, you can begin to imagine how the orientation of your side chain relative to the backbone will affect your ability to form an ordered structure as you cool down. And so when you go and measure the glass transition temperature for these, you can see that basically the less, in some sense, the less structured the polymer backbone is, the lower the glass transition temperature is, which is essentially saying that it's sort of more of an amorphous component. It's more difficult for it to crystallize. And so this is just within a single polymer type, polypropylene. Now you can also imagine moving out of the polypropylene class of polymers, looking at other sort of household polymers like polyethylene. So we get rid of this sort of bulkier methyl group and replace it with a hydrogen. And then increasing it all the way up to these bulky things like polystyrene. You know, polystyrene is very brittle. There's a very high glass transition temperature. And so all this means that you have to be above 100 degrees Celsius in order to get that plastic state, in order to have some ability to flow. In order for it essentially to kind of behave like that polyethylene bag or something, right? Where you can bend it, ply it. If you do that with polystyrene and room temperature, it'll break. It's very brittle. And so all this to say is that it's an example of how these functional groups kind of affect polymer properties that you can kind of begin to sense out in everyday objects like the high impact polystyrene, but low density polyethylene, Ziplocs that we use. And maybe I should have showed this earlier, but this is an example here where you can often think of polymeric materials as being like a block of ramen, where you have these domains, these ordered domains here, and you have amorphous domains. And again, it's often attributed these kind of either tecticity or the sort of side chains and their arrangement relative to the backbone will affect sort of what fraction of the material will be well ordered and crystalline versus amorphous. And again, these properties are very important. For instance, crystalline regions in cellulose, for instance, are much harder to break down by enzymes or acid, and so it becomes sort of a more challenging feedstock for biorefining processes, where you're trying to use cellulose as a feedstock as a food essentially for fermentation. Whereas if you're more amorphous, then you can sort of be attacked chemically more easily. And then another thing when you're thinking about polymers, so I guess what I'm slowly doing is building up this sort of complex picture. Right? You have chains, they're of different size. You have your side groups which determine chemistry, but then also how they're oriented relative to that side chain that'll impact packing properties. But then there's also another layer to it where we want to modify those interactions, and there's a whole bunch of strategies to do that. You can do things like cross-linking. Cross-linking is very common. That's how tires are made, or polyacrylamide gels if you do biology. The other alternative is plasticizers, which are basically small molecules that can sort of tune the interactions between neighboring chains, and they can make things more plastic in this case. So in this instance, phthalate is used to lower the glass transition temperature. Phthalate is a small organic molecule, so it's volatile. The common example, the classic example, I think, is when you buy a new car. The new car smell is essentially plasticizers going off into the air because they're volatile. And so over time, those will dissipate, and over long time scales, they'll essentially be depleted from the material. And you'll notice in these, I forget what material these wire casings are made of. I think I don't remember. But over time, I think it's PVC. They become brittle after the plasticizer is left. And so I think that process takes about 10 years or so. I think my headphones are doing this now. So so it's interesting because when you go as maybe as a designer or a consumer, right, you have this poly PVC product. There's no indication that this is in your object. Would that have implications for how you might say recycle the product if you wanted to, if you're an entrepreneur trying to make use of waste streams? Or if you're concerned about human health, is it fair that the presence of these compounds aren't made transparent to you? Because I think, I'll touch back on that later. Anyway, plasticizers are small molecules, but it's a huge business. So again, also some numbers. It's like $100 billion a year industry just on those little small molecules that don't really go into the ingredient label most of the time. And these are sort of the different industries that they're used for. As you can see, wires and cables are a big fraction of it. So they're great. They're complex. They give us a lot of amazing products cheaply. So what's the problem? I don't know. Should we discuss this or move on? Any thoughts? Feedback, comments? Pollution? Yeah. What form of plastic pollution bothers you the most, if any?
Me personally?
Yeah.
None of them.
Okay.
I don't see the problem with that for me.
Yeah.
I don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other
I think the polyethylene, I think the biggest problem.
yeah, because what is it?
It's the most popular one,
Hmm.
and it's difficult to reduce. I mean, to destroy this molecular.
Yeah, the carbon backbone is very stable. Everything's like polyester.
And there's another problem microplastic stuff.
Yeah.
Which is become more popular stuff.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure what's the big difference between microplastic and less plastic.
Mhm.
I'm sure see that on like a college and
Okay.
I like started thinking about microplastics, which is obviously not true. So like the boiling water becoming made out of plastic, or how do you know what's going into the water? And the other one is I like recently learned that we're going to buy synthetic materials and you wash them. The microplastics, the microplastics that go into the water, which then goes into whatever type of it gets drained.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that at all before I was.
Yeah, that's the plastic and clothing one is it's so ubiquitous, right? But it's often I still find it weird that you look at a plastic water bottle and you look at your clothes and they're often they're the same. It's the same material, and I think there's a company also that's explicitly making chino pants out of recycled water bottles allegedly. At least that's their claim. Yeah, that's a fun example about washing. There's a paper that came out recently where they basically coated the fibers of some clothing with a molecule that's inert, but also reduces the sort of friction between fibers. So basically lubricating the fibers, and they basically demonstrated that treatment significantly reduces the amount of microplastics or debris, right, that comes from when you wash your clothes.
It's kind of plastified, or
Yes, I think they use nylon fibers and they coated it with a silicone. With the type of silicone. Was able to reduce the amount of shedding, you could say.
There's two something do that we know there's microplastic in the food.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good fish. Mhm. Yeah, they also, I think the big proposed mechanism for their sort of toxicity is that they also will act as sinks for other organic pollutants that might be in the environment. And so they're kind of like carriers of organic contamination. If you were to take a clean little bit of microplastic, it doesn't seem so clear that in itself is a significant risk to human health. But I know that that's an active area of research. I think a more established link is this idea of transporting organic pollutants as it's kind of a Trojan horse into the body. And things like perfluoroalkanes, PFAs, there's been a lot of talk about those being fairly toxic as endocrine disruptors at fairly small concentrations, and so those can hit right on these particles, bioaccumulate and percolate up the food chain, I suppose. Yeah, so that's one dimension of the problem, I suppose. Somebody had mentioned petroleum as basically being the feedstock. This is kind of an impression, I guess, of the life cycle of plastic. So here's a industrial refining facility where you would get things like your protein monomers. Your plasticizers would probably come from a facility like this. It's basically processing crude oil, fractionating it, and converting it into commercially relevant molecules. And these would be then sent all over the world to be used in higher value add processes like maybe the polymerization itself, or in other chemical processes. And then those in turn would be incorporated into other products, which would then be incorporated in other products, and then eventually sold to consumers, and then disposed of in some way, which usually I think falls out of the normal purview of product design. What do you do after the user is done with it? Yeah.
It's probably a simple question. Is the crude that's used for plastic production the exact same what's used for energy, or like the time for energy? Are they distinct? Or it seems strange to me that like the cost of crude or like the cost of these fuels is so expensive in energy, but then with plastic it feels like it's a lot cheaper. So I'm wondering how those life cycles might interact.
Yeah, I know that the cost of plastic is, well, it's cheap. It isn't static, so it is susceptible to the same kind of market shocks. I think the way to think about it is that they come from the same place, but they're not the same thing, right? So you fractionate your crude oil, and some elements will be used for chemical feedstocks, others will be used for energy. And even when you look at like natural what do I want to say, fossil fuels, right? There's a lot of different categories. You have like light sweet crude oil. You have products that come from fracking, right? It's so natural gas, basically. Those produce different byproducts that end up in different streams, and it's quite complicated. I haven't done a dive myself, but I think it is kind of basically giant separation processes are really the core to the modern materials economy. Yeah.
So like what happens to plastic production if fossil fuels are no longer used?
They would become very expensive, I would imagine. You'd have to mine. I guess that would be a nice segue into the biomaterials thing, alternatives to petroleum-based plastics.
And plastics produced mostly from gas, and prices for gas didn't was the same for a long time. The price for crude oil was changed over had some fluctuations, but the price for gas just increased like a couple of years, like last year. There was like a really huge increase, and actually I think the production of plastic increased as well. And also even there was changes in crude oil prices. It's still like pretty the same, like around 100 or maybe a little bit less. So yeah, production of plastic is always like cheap.
Yeah, actually, that'd be something to include at some point, would be like, showing the graph of like, how these things kind of fluctuate in time. I don't have a good mental picture of that in my head right now.
And they produce a lot of plastic from like a one amount of like a gas or something.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. I, I guess just to round up so this is the kind of the origin, and then this is, I think this is a landfill in India.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
No, no, it's like-
yeah, me too. Yeah, we discussed it a couple of times, but, this is probably the most extreme example of just where waste accumulates. This is sort of, this is an example of a landfill that was supposed to close down, I think 30 years ago, and, it didn't, and it's still just continuing to pile up, and so a lot of this stuff ends up being, burned, ends up in runoff. Um, yeah,
Health issues.
yeah.
Those mountains are like trash.
Yeah, it's trapped.
This is trash. Yeah.
Or something like that.
No, maybe in 10,000 years, it might be something more solid.
No, it's something like, it's in the nearby town, or something like two towns over. It's pretty significant.
Yeah. So I guess all this to say, it's important to think about where this stuff ends up as well. I mean, particularly, I think this class also has a big design component as well, and just like, thinking about the full life cycle of products. I know that's touching on much more. So yeah, there's a nice paper here. This basically does a statistical analysis of just like what, it's been 50 years since plastics first started to be produced at massive scales, and then just asking the question, what's happened to it, all of it, and they come up with these numbers. About 9% of all plastic produced has been recycled, 12% has been incinerated, and 79% is accumulated in landfills, some of which are managed better than others. And basically that, the amount of plastic is expected to double in the environment. Forget how they define in the environment, but the point is, it's still, we're still on an exponential trend.
To add on,
Yeah.
I think we'll have a slide on this that briefly slightly different, but it's good to think about plastic. I mean, plastic is great, right, for a lot of things, but if you think of the life cycle of the plastic, if you're, these COVID tests that we take every week or so now, those are thrown out, they have a lifetime of like a month, right, in your shelf until you actually use it. And versus other things that we saw in the construction, where it was, I don't know which side, but it's somewhere in there, right? Yeah. So if that lasts like 50 years, then that usage maybe is more applicable, right? Other than like a single use, it's like the fast stashing
Right.
trend that it's not on the slide, but Anthony and I were talking about the stash stashing, where it's like a week long.
Yeah, they have week-long fashion cycles
Yeah.
instead of seasonal fashion
So it's
cycles.
meant to be like worn once or twice,
Yeah.
and then it's in the past. So like that accelerates that number quite significantly,
Yeah.
as opposed to more hardy plastics or things like that.
Yeah. So I guess it's a little bit about thinking about kind of responsible use of plastics.
Yeah.
And where it might be appropriate. And just to provide, I guess, a little bit more geopolitical. Anyway, when you're disposing of plastic, right, it is this international aspect of it where even at the end of life, we're still spending a lot of resources just moving around our waste. And this is another paper that was looking on China affected a ban on plastic waste import. And these guys wanted to analyze sort of what effects that might have. And here they're showing just the inflows to China from various countries. And as a result of that ban, right, now these waste streams have to go elsewhere. And the conclusion was, many of those places that they are being directed are far less equipped to deal with that waste than China was. So So where does it end up? You know, big concern is the ocean. These are sort of like leakages in plastic waste streams. You know, so altogether adds up to about 10 million tons have probably fallen off trucks and other, just basically entered the environment in an uncontrolled way since 2010, apparently. So Brad, this is what Anessa was mentioning, that saying what's for various classes of objects, what's the average sort of service life of those? So, things like food packaging or, face masks are very short. And maybe those are like high leverage point targets to mitigate kind of the waste problem. But then things like buildings and construction, maybe that's a great place to use plastics because they're going to hang out for a long time and they don't really represent the kind of environmental burden. And then on the right here is just, to say that the uptake of sort of bio-based or biodegradable alternatives is slow. In Europe, the market share still is around 1% in Europe. And I would guess that they're probably the highest on the high end. There's also a distinction there. There's a lot of lack of clarity around bio-based, biodegradable, and I guess that's not great from a design point of view because it's challenging to know exactly what you're using, what you should use, and also from a sort of recycling, repurposing, end of life point of view. Because you don't know which bin to throw it in.
And even biodegradability depends on where you actually throw the waste. So like if you're throwing your apple core somewhere else other than the compost, it might not be composed the way that we intended to be decomposed. So it might just sit there without the right enzymes to break it down.
Yeah, so recycling codes, I think so. From at least from the polymer chemistry point of view, these are woefully inadequate. And there's an NPR report that came out a couple of years ago that kind of describes these as sort of marketing convenience, I suppose. It's an interesting read. I would recommend it. And there's also, I think the fundamental problem with recycling comes down to the fact that now the quality of the material depends on how it's recycled and how many times. So there's a physical phenomenon called chain scission. And here basically is a graph showing that the molecular number, so a measure of that size distribution, is being reduced as a function of the number of times it's been extruded. So now all of a sudden, if you're going to try to retain the quality of your materials or even just advertise the quality of your recycled materials, you have to keep track of the recycling history. And this scheme is woefully inadequate to do that. So there's other schemes that people have thought of. So I mean, China gets at they have a very elaborate, much more elaborate polymer identification scheme that includes not 7 elements but 140, which gives you much finer resolution over the chemical composition. And in industry, Hewlett-Packard has a really sort of comprehensive marking requirements that goes into like saying if there's reinforcement compounds, basically if things are mixed to it, how much recycled content's used, yeah, just a lot more detail. And so we could probably learn from some of these things and it might be inspirational for dealing with it. Again, Europe is also has some interesting legislation about requiring digital product passports, again, which now kind of creates a history of materials as they pass through the value chain and go through multiple lives. And the idea here is that it'll enable sort of effective recycling practices to be implemented and also give more consumer awareness. The implementation of this is an open question. And there's several different sort of companies that are built around trying to implement the details of this in a practical way, which I think is also kind of an exciting literature, if you want to call it that, to read and explore if this is a problem that you find interesting. So that's recycling. Then another aspect is biodegradability. Why bother with recycling if I can just throw it into the environment, and then it'll be sort of returned to nature, and then natural processes can take over, and we get a renewed feedstock. So, you know, for styrofoam cups, that scheme of repurposing materials at the end of life is impractical because you have to wait 500 years to forever, apparently, which is which is more than 1 million years. That's fun. I wonder how they know. Yeah, but if you're, you know, if all of your materials that you use and behave like vegetables, then you could toss like a banana peel, and then maybe you know, you're in these bioengineering vision of the future, it'll turn into a cell phone or something useful. You can imagine, I mean, it's fun to imagine what it would be like to build those systems. It's really fun. And it's, again, open challenge. And then there's the idea of, you know, biodegradability and plastics. You know, there's some, again, a little bit of a bioengineering aspect here. There's a lot of microbes that have evolved to metabolize polyesters. They're a little bit easier than the polyethylenes. So carbon oxygen is a little bit more labile, a little bit weaker than the carbon-carbon bonds found in polyethylene. And so, you know, being able to do things like directed evolution on these enzymes that nature is evolving could be a really interesting way of sort of bringing a regenerative biomaterials framework to synthetic materials like plastics. Yeah. Okay, next section, biomaterials. I guess we're running, how's time?
We're stuck around.
25 minutes. I think we're almost.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's any.
You guys know what comes to mind when you think about biomaterials? Cardiac?
No, that's like my favorite biomaterial for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Wood and paper are very related.
Basically anything that comes from nature, like, you know, what does that really mean, right? So
Yeah. Oh yeah, fashion. I mean, cotton is probably the best one. We're all, many people are wearing jeans. Cotton. I think I read this number. It's actually in this book. This is a great book that I convinced Vanessa to read pretty easily. But like if you were to stretch out the thread in a pair of jeans, right? It's something like the distance between here to San Francisco. You can imagine how, in earlier times, how much effort it goes into making even before that, right? The cotton that's used now looks like this. This is a result of like 10,000 years of selective breeding. Wild cotton kind of looks like this.
Yeah.
So just
pretty useful.
yeah, and it's just kind of gives you this appreciation of how far some of these systems, how we influence these systems and how far we've come in evolving these biomaterials. Yeah, and this is kind of just an evolution. I don't know. This is these are flax-based clothes. Flax is basically a bush. It's common in Northern Europe. Used to make things like clothes, but also canvas. Like if you're into oil painting. On the right is sort of, I think those are probably synthetic-based clothes. She's basically wearing, you know, fossil fuels. In the middle is kind of a hybrid. And, 'cause, 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 ' Or maybe not.
dinosaurs, yeah.
What's that?
Wearing dinosaurs.
Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah. I don't know. Sometimes when you walk around, you think about these things, it makes life very interesting. This is addressed by Stella McCarthy. It's very nice, I guess, if you're into grapes. Anyway, it's made from spider silk proteins. And the reason it's when this was made, what's that? Oh, when it was made, it's still really hard to make spider silk proteins at this scale, which is why I don't think they actually put it on person. I couldn't find a photo of it where it was actually like sort of being used. I wonder if that's the reason, but yeah, spider silk is probably the like trendiest version of a biomaterials now. And there's a handful of companies that are now producing these at very large scales. But all this to say, the use of biomaterials is ubiquitous and ancient, which is interesting. So let's see, I think cotton, flax, paper, those are all basically lignocellulosic materials. But biomaterials generally, you can also think of proteins. So that's this state. But it would also be your spider silk proteins, right? They're protein-based materials. It could also be oils, which I don't think there's a really great material made. It's high, has a high fat content, you could say. But they're often used as plasticizers in these other biomaterials. And starch, carbohydrate-based things would be like, I think there's a lot of starch-based hydrogels. So, and DNA is probably the most futuristic. There's a lot of crazy DNA nanostructures that people are building, but macroscopic examples of DNA-based material are rare. So these would be the biomolecules for completeness. And here, plants, like this is kind of the argument of just using plants. So that'd be doing more with wood than we're already doing. We already do a lot with wood in the sense of paper products, personal hygiene products, right? Like diapers, bandages, menstrual pads, all make use of cellulosic pulp, which is derived from timber. Of course, cotton is plants, but from just the mass of stuff on Earth, it's by far the largest share. So thinking about that as a feedstock is probably very useful, and there's a huge, big topic in the material science community of coming up with all sorts of new things to do with cellulose-based resources, making wood that you can mold, making wood transparent, using it as cathodes and batteries, and probably a ton of other things that I don't remember. And for perspective, I think the amount of plastic produced from like 10 slides ago was 6 million tons. Right? What I want to say is the amount of plastic produced is a small fraction of the amount of plant-based biomass. And yeah, so basically what I just said, plant, trees, 50% of the mass of a tree is basically cellulose, another 30% is lignin. We're much better at using the cellulose than the lignin. The lignin is, for the most part, burned to power paper mills. I believe that's the primary industrial use of it. And there's, in the last 10 years, a growing trend to extract valuable kind of small molecules like vanilla. Synthetic vanilla is basically a byproduct of the wood industry, for instance. And then there's also a lot of kind of interesting work on figuring out how to make lignin-based plastics. So there's a group, I think, in Oak Ridge that has a purely lignin-based 3D printing filament. So type of material you could extrude. I'm guessing you could probably also imagine that for maybe injection molding. And there's some other interesting, more things that might behave like polyethylene.
Just a side note on this, cellulose is more hydrophobic versus lignin is more hydrophobic, which will come into play a little bit.
Yeah. So that's a piece of wood, and I don't know if you can tell, but it's a mixture of lignin and cellulose. The brown bits are mostly the lignin. Pure cellulose is very white. And so a big part of sort of microscale resolution, it's cellulose organizes itself into fibers, which in turn are organized from elementary fibrils. And then those fibers are bundled together by lignin and a little bit of this thing called hemicellulose, which is basically a branched type of cellulose that acts as sort of a glue. There's some proteins in there. And then biology organizes this into pretty complex biological structures like phloem and xylem, are sort of these tubes that organize around this lignocellulosic scaffold to conduct water and do transpiration, and also just physically support the mass of the tree, which is no small task. So next slide is this. Yeah, so a lot of biorefining, biomanufacturing, pulping is broken down to the task of separating these components. So biomanufacturing is one model where you try to extract the sugars from lignocellulosic feedstocks, often trees. And there you're trying to extract the sugar so that you can feed, you kind of convert it to bioethanol, or in a more advanced way, use it to feed organisms for fermentative bioproduction, which is becoming more and more sophisticated, right? So that's basically the process by which the spider silk is produced. So now you have this process of taking sugars from biowaste to producing really cool protein-based materials that have great properties and look fashionable. I think here there's a little, so those are the molecule factors that eat the sugar and turn into useful proteins. And this was one of the first projects, Frenzymes, which was launched in the first iteration of this course during the lockdown, where they were trying to engineer sort of an open toolkit of enzymes to make fermentative bioproduction a little bit more accessible. And I think this project is still ongoing. So if it's something that those kind of ideas interest you, you can definitely reach out to the team that runs it. Yeah, they're pretty responsive. The other sort of mode is pulping. So this is how you get paper, right? You take your logs, you debark them. The bark is pretty lignin rich, so you burn it and use it as fuel to power your mill. And then you chip it, and then you have these cellulose rich chips. You wash those, you steam explode them to open up the pores and expose it to chemicals, which will then separate those bonds and hold together the cellulose and lignin. And then you collect some other fractions as they're burned or try to convert into further value-add chemicals. And then you get your cellulose fibers. And typically those are bleached, so you get nice kind of like white paper, or that would be used in hygiene products. And then there's a big process of drying those fibers. And a lot of care is done in recycling the chemicals that are used. And that's part of the reason these plants have to be so massive, is that the infrastructure to do the chemical recycling operates at a very high scale. But this is like a very mature, you could say maybe traditional form of bioprocessing that I don't think gets as much attention as it probably deserves. And it's something that we've thought a lot about in this case study, where we're looking at materials and menstrual hygiene. So I'll let you go from there.
So right now, there's an estimate of about 500 million people in the world who lack menstrual hygiene products. And it comes from this report, the FSG report, which looks at what are the issues. Like, is it the cost? Is it the availability of material? Is it everything? So all of these kind of come together to assess that we don't have enough menstrual pad products. Obviously, there are reusable products. There are other types of products. But right now there is still a huge demand for menstrual pads as opposed to tampons or reusable pads or even the menstrual cups. So those things exist. It's just right now the adoption rates are just way lower, and there's a high preference for sanitary pads over anything else. And going back to kind of the raw materials, so we were looking at most of these cellulose-based products are made from wooded sources, right? So then right now, more than half of the world's forests are found in only just 5 countries, which means there's an unequal distribution of obviously wooded resources for producing of these absorbent products, right? And if we are just looking at the based on those 5, you have Brazil, Canada, Russia, US, and China, and Canada, obviously. Those are the 3 largest exporters of these pulps. So these are the you take the timber and you go through these kind of chemical treatments that Anthony was just mentioning, and these are the top 3 countries are exporting these materials. And who's buying them? Primarily China. China's a huge producer of menstrual pad products, so they are taking the pulps that they're importing and putting it together, assembling it with the top and bottom layers into pads, and then selling them elsewhere. So a lot of these countries, even when we were trying to understand, where are these being manufactured, obviously China, but there are some local manufacturing in Kenya and in Nigeria and a lot of these places, but what does that actually really mean, right? They're not making the pulp because that pulp is just really difficult to make. It's a huge scale of work to actually make the pulp. So how are they actually manufacturing these? So mainly what we concluded is that a lot of these local manufacturing is actually just local assembly of the final product. So they're taking the fluff pulp and the top and bottom layers, are importing all these raw materials, and they're basically sandwiching it together in a pad and manufacturing them out locally. But that doesn't, let's see. So all that is great, these giant companies making pads, they're somewhat low cost. I mean, they're low cost for us, they're not so low cost for other parts of the world. And you can see that if you're just looking at the left-hand side, which is the urban, you can see, okay, Niger, a lot of these countries in Africa and Asia are, using a lot of sanitary pads, right? What's the problem? So a lot of the problem comes in the rural areas where these products are not reaching the market. I mean, they're not there because of the last mile distribution, but also because of cost. I mean, how are you expecting someone to spend 20 cents per pad when they're making $2 a month? Like it doesn't make sense. Like the math is taken that. And this problem comes at obviously multi-layers, and there's obviously just the design side that you're now stuck in this kind of menstrual pad and tampons, and it hasn't really evolved so much, and the adaptation isn't there yet. We spoke about raw materials where we don't just have the wood products everywhere around the world, hence where we're looking into other biomaterials for resources. Manufacturing, they're great at scale, large scale for pulp milling and everything, but how can we make that to be more localized so that it can actually reach that last mile and actually reach the users that actually need them in the most remote areas? And that requires a different kind of treatment, different kind of chemical treatments and manufacturing this mentality. Obviously, there's also quality control, which we're working on that as well on our project. Distribution. So if we are making them locally, there's a greater chance that it actually reaches the market that is served. We don't have an example for menstrual pad project specifically, but we did I have to cite it here, but we did find a paper who was talking about pharmaceuticals. So if drugs that are made locally are actually reaching the markets that are in the most remote areas, as opposed to drugs that are coming in from the US or even parts of Europe, they're not actually reaching these areas. So there is evidence that local manufacturing does reach the remote. So basically what is a pad, just basically 3 layers. There's the top layer, which is mostly pores, that's just to get the dimensional drive through, and the middle is kind of what we're focusing on right now. This is absorbent core, which is what we call the fluff pulp. And finally, the bottom layer, which we're also still working on, is mostly the non-porous impermeable layer on the bottom. The most standard, I guess, always in full type, a lot of these contain, as you can see, a lot of plastic aside from the cellulose base. So these plastics come from partially the top layer, but mainly also the bottom layer, which is non-porous. Is the most benefit of plastic that being non-porous. And then also a lot of these pads, and if you have an open one, or here's the open one, they contain these super absorbent polymers. These are tiny little beads that are basically the gels. They absorb a lot of liquid, and they are able to retain it. So that's why a lot of these pads claim that they are super thin, because they have these super absorbent polymers in them. Obviously, there are other up and coming companies who are looking into other sources. So, you might have heard of Sati. That's kind of one of the more common ones in India right now. They have a line with bamboo and banana. There's also other companies looking at jute, but you can see that might be a little bit more uncomfortable, so a little bit less processed. So they all vary in the amount of processing of the fibers. You can see that you can just see based on the color itself how much processing.
And I guess one thing for this, when we were starting this project, was the question of, should we focus on sort of looking at like developing new materials to accomplish absorption, or does it make sense to stick with this to essentially stick with the original material, cellulose itself, and think about how can we make it more accessible, really. So I mean, all of these are basically cellulose fibers being used for absorption, and the difference is the extent to which they're successfully extracted from the sort of natural plant context. And because of the abundance, because of the existence of a lot of efforts already around this way of thinking, we thought it would be more fruitful to address that issue of making the extraction of cellulose fibers as accessible as possible, and to see to what extent that concept is true. To what extent can we get like a high quality geoben from this diverse array of different materials, be it bamboo, banana, water hyacinth, jute, and a ton of other things like that, fibers that we've learned about in the process of this work.
Yeah, and there's various levels of treatment, as you mentioned. There's simply thermomechanical, which is what the DC is doing. There's some kind of more of the chemical extraction of cellulose, which I think is using a little bit. You can see water basic, I think it's probably not mostly just mechanical treatment with just steam and heating up the fibers. And obviously there are tools like this. You also maybe have seen the Padman movie or read about it. So machines like this that are geared to more small to medium scale manufacturing allows for local production of these pads. As we said before, a lot of these local manufacturing are still kind of focused on the final assembly of the pads themselves. So we are mostly tackling the extraction process.
Right, and I think one of the other things that validated this idea of just sort of trying to make this existing ecosystem of materials and products more efficient and more sustainable from an environmental point of view was that these tools exist. We don't want to try to invent new things, like a new innovates so much on like the shape of a pad. We've seen proposals that kind of suggested doing really new things, but then you sort of lose out from possible synergies by teaming up with these manufacturers. The problem with these guys is that their machines are generally optimized for using roll-to-roll materials, and they're optimized for the material properties of those rolls. And so transitioning these over to, say, bio-based plastics might require some optimization, which many of these entrepreneurs wouldn't be. It would be a risk for them to do that optimization, or they might not be equipped to do it. And then similarly for the fluff pulp as well. Incorporating that into some of these semi-automated workflows is also a challenge.
There's also a note on the fluff pulp that these are, again, coming from all parts, just very specific parts of the world, so mainly in China and US and so transporting themselves to different parts of the world already contributes to that much of the carbon footprint. So it transport a lot of materials across sea. So how can we actually implement that locally? I mean, the materials there locally, so are we kind of shipping them off elsewhere to process and then bring them back for manufacture? A lot of those are kind of wasted efforts. Currently we have looked at using banana pseudostems. So the pseudostems are actually there. So when banana trees grow and they the fruits, you harvest the fruit and then you do have to cut it down for it to actually grow. So you would have to chop that off, and it all becomes agricultural waste. So instead of having it as a waste source, can we repurpose that? And a lot of the companies that we saw earlier have already taken advantage of banana, and banana itself, I think naturally does pretty well already without any much treatment. I mean, we tested the absorption ratio is actually quite nice compared to just pure cotton. We are focusing on sisal. Let me just mention really quick water haze. And water haze is also another water weed that's actually happening a lot in Nigeria and a lot of parts in India. These clog a lot of waterways. They just grow in water. They're like water lilies, basically, but they can make a river toxic.
And yeah, just another thing, these plants also represent very different sort of biomes. So sisal can exist in semi-arid regions and exists on pretty much no water. So there's a lot of land that would be unsuitable for conventional kind of commodity crops. So this model could work in that environment. Water hyacinth is pretty much localized to these riverine regions, right? You have to have a freshwater body of water in order for this to exist. But where it does, it exists in massive numbers, and it's a lot of money spent just disposing of it. And so there's a lot of people that are thinking about doing something constructive with that. And then banana pseudostems is more often associated with tropical climates. So I guess part of this is the normal paradigm is wood exists in 5 countries, mostly in the northern hemisphere, and the economy is built around transporting this material to various production sites, and even within that efficient model, it still leaves a lot of gaps in access to products made from downstream, the downstream materials, and tapping into these sources of biomass can potentially localize that production and maybe address some of these gaps in different biomes, let's say.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's just also reusing a lot of these materials for more, alternative usage. Like sisal has been used for ropes. When can we leverage that and kind of increase our production for something else? Water haze right now are being dried and woven into baskets. So we are also working with, we're putting together kind of a consortium, and one of the collaborators is in Nigeria working with water haze, and then she does social enterprises with woven baskets. But she's looking for other usage of why we can be done just something like that. This is a map of the top 10 countries that produce sisal. This number can easily increase I forget the hectare number for production, but it's quite low. So you can see that you can grow a lot, and similar to banana, actually, they grow up to, you can harvest the leaf and it can grow again really easily for like 8 to 10 years before you actually really have to go back from the seedling, because it takes about 3 to 5 years for it to kind of mature. Here's kind of a diagram of showing and some SEM images showing the chemical process that kind of glanced over earlier. So we first start with boiling the fibers, and that's to get rid of all the biological matter that, and so make sure that it doesn't rot over time. And then we perform the process formic acid treatment on them, which softens and somewhat removes the lignin away from the cellulose fibers, and you construct hemicellulose. So all we're trying to get is kind of the nice cleaning cellulose fibers in the end. The sodium hydroxide wash takes all that kind of debundled product of lignin, hemicellulose, everything else that might have come in, and solubilizes that. And then when you do the wash, it removes all that, and then in the end we have the materials. And you can see that throughout the process. The the fibers themselves are deblending in that process.
Yeah, and an important aspect, peroxyformic acid can be produced from relatively simple reagents that can be produced on site using commercially available catalytic systems. And so that's kind of the part of the supply chain that we're trying to take advantage of. Formic acid is used, is being developed pretty aggressively for developing energy storage capacities, so chemical energy storage, and hydrogen peroxide is used in a lot of food industries at relatively small scales to say sanitize. If you're doing beer, you need to wash your tanks after usage, or if you're doing things like aquaponics, you have to keep things sterile. And so there's a lot of work being done to make these reagents in a way that doesn't, you don't have to transport them because it's costly and dangerous. So the cost of those technologies is coming down. That's something we're trying to exploit in this scheme.
And that's boxed up, that's we have a cycle plant, we boil it and we treat it and we would then air dry into this thing called a fluff board. Typically this comes in rolls, this is what's actually being sold in China and for these companies to actually use a menstrual pad, and then we would kind of dry blend them, and we'll talk briefly about why we're dry blend. We have to increase the porosity, that's how we gain the absorption ratio to be higher. And from that point, we would then create these little stamps, and that's how we have done our kind of absorption test. And you can see that from the boiled, which is no treatment at all, to the final fluff board, we are actually able to exceed the absorption ratio that from pure cotton that we have extracted from other tests. Yeah, basically, the greater the porosity, the better the absorption.
Let's go over that.
Yeah, and then this is kind of this is the end.
Just assessing the environmental impact quantitatively. It's a messy subject. Good.
Yeah. Okay, if there are no questions, I do return to the one logistical note, and I guess it's all mine. By Thursday, you should have your group that you would like to work with. You should join this one team. So one with you're allowed to